This is Joe Delio from the live community bringing you the Q&A session from the webinar about GlobalProtect Best Practices Tuning and Resources presented by David Cumbow and Derek Bergman. If you missed the webinar, I'll be sure to provide links to that video below in the description. I'll do my best to record the questions asked in the description field for others who had similar questions. So without further ado, I hand off to David and the rest of the guys with the Q&A.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and answer some of these questions live while I do as well. Got a question here. Any tips for a dashboard to show details of GlobalProtect traffic and users? Is the remote user count under the gateway and an ACC tab against the GlobalProtect zone in the best we can look at? So you have a few options there, right? One of the things you can do is, as mentioned, just create a ACC tab filter for the zone, the source zone being that GlobalProtect zone. That'll actually give you visibility into what that traffic looks like. Is it going to the internet? Is it going internally? As for number of connected users, a lot of those enhancements are in PAN-OS 9.1. They are really good enhancements there. But again, I would hold off on making that my primary PAN-OS version for now. As of March 23rd, 2020, I would hold off on that. Some of the other things you could do as well is under Network, GlobalProtect, gateways, before you click on any of your gateways on the right-hand side there is the option to click and look at currently connected users versus previously connected users. Unfortunately, at this time, there's no way to extract that information out. Mr. McAllister, anything you could think of in that regards that you'd want me to, that you would touch upon as well?
No, you nailed it. I guess I would just add that just a reminder for everybody on the call that the CLI, sorry, at least with the on-prem firewall, the CLI and the APIs are actually supersets of what you can accomplish with the web UI. So just keep that in mind. Depending upon the use case, there might be some advantages to scripting some of those as well.
Yeah, so Donald, that kind of answers your question a little bit too. Is there a method to get a list of all VPN users who connect each day with the time connected and the length connected? Again, right now, it's best bet is to go through and you can do it through the CLI, right? As Aaron mentioned, but best bet is to click on the connected users information on the right-hand side of your gateway there. Best practices for VoIP over VPN. Mr. McAllister, you want to touch on that one at a high level?
Yeah, I would just say, yeah, for just in general, for any delay sensitive protocol, whether that's VoIP or VTC, care should be taken to properly implement things like QoS, which, optionally you can map delay sensitive protocols like RTP, for example, to one of our 8 hardware classes. So by default, everything hits hardware class 4, and that's best effort. So for things like RTP, I always recommend consider putting them into hardware class 2, or something higher than 4 at least. And then for the most part, though, we certainly have a lot of users across the world that are leveraging soft phones over the top of GlobalProtect. So in general, just like any, traversing for that traffic to traverse any kind of tunnel, there potentially can be things like fragmentation and MTU considerations, but for the most part, we don't experience any of those in general.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, thanks, sir. And a lot of it does come down to just, again, it sounds pretty trivial, but just best practices around, doing, high bandwidth or what you would normally do for VoIP, right? So make sure you have enough bandwidth for wherever you're tunneling it back to, things along that line. There is a article out there, I'd have to find it and search for it, but there's an article out there around specifically VoIP over Prisma access, right? And how we handle that traffic as well. So that would be a good one to jump into. Any ACC dashboard for GP stats, again, definitely something that is there in PAN-OS 9.1. That's going to be huge help in that regard. So other than that, my recommendation, what I used to do as well, right, is go through and create a dashboard, create your favorite dashboard, and then go through, and when you are done creating that dashboard, in the upper right-hand corner of that creation screen where you're adding the widgets or moving the widgets around, you have the ability to apply a tab level filter, and apply that tab level filter as being the source zone or source IP address that your devices are given. And then you can at least look at where your traffic's coming from, going to who your top users are. That's the other nice thing about GlobalProtect too. You have really high fidelity in regards to the users that are connected. So your user ID information will be updated too. So you always see the number of users, number of sessions they have, things along that line as well. Should the VPN tunnel IP address be in the same subnet as the client IP pool or different subnet? You know, I think best practices is different subnet. Much of the configuration that you're going to see out there recommends that you do it a different subnet. You know, my VPN tunnel IP address, that gateway IP address was something that was externally available and accessible by you know, people that are off our network. And then that internal network, even though we used a 10/8 at my last job for most internal connections, we used a 172.31/16 for that IP pool. And you can add multiple IP pools and stuff like that too. I know there is a document out there about avoiding overlapping IP addresses and things along that line. Sorry, I meant to mark that for answering live. So if you're looking at the recording, please go back on what is being answered live right now. Any SNMP info we can grab for GP stats? Mr. McAllister, do you know if there is any SNMP info? I'd have to look at our MIBs again. I don't know off the top of my head.
I do. Yeah, we actually have a few more options in as of PanOS 9.1. So if anybody, I'm just saying that in case anybody's doing a quick search, just make sure you're on the right version that's relevant to you. But we have 4 MIBs in particular that are all listed on the page that I just included specific to that question. So please see that link for additional detail. But the short answer is yes.
Okay, Golden. Thank you, sir. Best practice to place the VPN zone IP on a loopback interface. That one I don't know off the top of my head. Mr. McAllister, I'm going to lean on you again for that one too.
Yeah, so not specific to a loopback, I'd be interested to hear the use case there, but in general, the way the best practice documentation reads is that you want to terminate the tunnel into a separate zone. So the short answer, I guess, is yes, but picture a very, you know, simple configuration involving kind of an outside or untrust zone and then an inside or trust zone. The recommendation, just with GlobalProtect in general, I'm referring to the answer here on, is to terminate it into a third zone, so that then you have to go out of your way to write security policy from that zone to inside or from that zone to outside. So it doesn't need to be bound to a loopback. I don't know if there's any advantage necessarily in tying that to a loopback, but in the end, the net effect is the same. The way I picture it is, if I had an older kind of legacy VPN concentrator, I would, from a best practice standpoint, want to hang that off of a DMZ on my firewall, have the tunnel traverse the untrust to that VPN concentrator, and then have the plain text traffic egress the VPN concentrator coming back into a different zone on the firewall. And that's easier to describe over a whiteboard. But the net effect is that as long as the tunnel terminates into a different zone, then you can control, you know, who has access to what resources at that point and have full visibility.
Good stuff. Hope that helps.
So real quick, just a couple of questions that are similar, specifically the questions about manual connect versus always on. I guess just to kind of summarize and use the wording that everyone will find in the documentation, whether it's, again, for on-prem GlobalProtect or cloud-hosted via Prisma Access. Sorry, can't talk today. The recommendation is to configure it always on. So by default, all of the gateways, whether they're in Prisma Access or on-prem, are in a latency list, and the gateway that responds to the agent quicker is who the traffic will then terminate on for the tunnel. So certainly an option to leave that as a manual process, and there are some use cases for that, but the recommendation is to essentially take that option off the table, just have the system be as dynamic as possible so that again, all the gateways are in play, but the one that's most available is responding quickest. And you can have some exceptions to that if you want to configure, for example, a one-time password that only the help desk has access to. They call into the help desk and they need to troubleshoot. There's an option similar to that. The question about kind of the pre-boot authentication, and it is operating system specific. So the answer for Windows would be slightly different than for Mac, and it would certainly be different on Android, iOS, Chrome, or Linux. Having said that, it looks like the question is specific to Windows, so I will include in the Q&A a link to a page that goes into a lot deeper detail.
I do see can I use user group-based security policy with SAML authentication using Azure GP app? I'm not quite sure what you mean about the Azure GP application. Any thoughts on that, Aaron? It's in the chat window, by the way.
So, yeah, if it's for, SAML, SSO, I do have customers using Microsoft Azure. Just as a general rule of thumb for anyone looking for documentation, the documentation for things like multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication has been around for GlobalProtect for over a decade. And so keep in mind, if you do a search for keywords like that, and you don't find the answer specific to Prisma Access, more than likely the documentation is still relevant. And the reason I mentioned that is the two links that I put in the answer for a similar question previously, they were specific to GlobalProtect, but for the most part, the configuration will be the same for Prisma Access.
Got it. And Azure Appliance is what he was referring to. Perfect. Yeah. All right. Let's see here. Connect to GlobalProtect via a SAML provider, which in turn authenticates us with Duo for MFA. We receive our initial user ID from our SAML provider and also synchronize with our AD environment and ClearPass for our wireless users. All of our GlobalProtect policies are user ID based. I have seen times where someone's user ID does not appear to refresh and they can no longer access internal resources due to the policy requiring user ID. Have you seen this issue? I personally have not. Derek or Aaron, have you guys seen anything along that line?
I'll take a stab at it. So this is Aaron. So I've certainly seen that type of a scenario with user ID without the GlobalProtect agent on box. So and I think it's important to compare that scenario first, because anytime we're leveraging, let's say, for example, the firewall to query domain controllers, security event logs via MSRPC or WMI, those are configurable options, but they're at kind of predefined intervals. And so no matter how frequently you configure those, you still have the possibility that there's a user to IP mapping that could be stale. Having the agent on box should keep that information passed to the firewall, passed to Prisma Access in near real time. So with the agent, I can't say for sure that I have seen that specifically. I guess the only thing I would add is that there are two components, two aspects of user ID. So there's a user to IP mapping and there's a user to group mapping. That user to group mapping requires LDAP, and those two are kind of by design decoupled. So if there's any kind of sync issue with the LDAP, the backend LDAP servers, and communicating any updates to the firewall, to Prisma Access, there could be a delay associated with that. But I just kind of wanted to frame that in as two separate issues to troubleshoot.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, sir. I have seen also, depending on where your user ID sources are coming from, that sometimes you will get mapped to a different user ID than maybe you're utilizing to authenticate, right? So you have, a different user ID that you authenticate to an end server through RDP or something along that line, and sometimes user ID will get kind of mixed up in that regards, but I don't think that's what's going on here. When you manually connect to GP, how does that affect existing application traffic? Example, open web pages, streaming video, etc. So Generally, streaming video is relatively, it buffers enough to catch up there. But specifically, depends on what you're doing with your traffic too, if you're doing split tunneling or not, right? If you're just saying, hey, only send traffic to 10.0.0.0/8 over this tunnel, then, your traffic shouldn't be affected. However, if you're sending all traffic over it, essentially your source IP address where you're coming from, your public internet IP address, is definitely going to update in that regards. I know that it is, a little bit lossless or lossful, I should say, when I connect or disconnect GlobalProtect myself, if I ever have to. But generally, applications nowadays, modern applications, that's the word I'm looking for, recover so quickly that we don't really run into any issues in that regards. What was the free BPA tool you mentioned? The free BPA tool is on the customer support portal. So if you go to support.paloaltonetworks.com, on the left-hand side under either tools or resources, I forget which one it is, you'll see best practice assessment. All you need is a tech support file pulled from your next generation firewall or your Panorama configure or your Panorama instance. And then you can upload it to that BPA tool, answer a few questions, and it'll kick out an amazing report in regards to all best practices for the firewalls, not just GlobalProtect, but all best practices in that regards. Question here, if a user has a home Mac and installed the GP client successfully and entered the portal address, why won't it connect and give the splash page? My guess would probably be certificate issues. It might be based off of how you have your GlobalProtect configured. So one of the best practices that Derek mentioned was to use a well-known trusted CA, certificate authority, right? And it's specifically to address these issues. If you have it set up to utilize your internal PKI, then it may be running into issues where that home Mac doesn't know about the certificate that's installed and that GlobalProtect is using through the next generation firewall. So that would be my first guess. Aaron, do you have any thoughts on that one? You're on mute, Aaron, if you're there. Might not have Aaron. Okay. So yeah, that would be my guess. I would guess it's a certificate issue in regards to, it'll let you install it, but if it won't let you connect and give the splash page, then probably some certificate issues going on in that regards. Why would 9.1 be released if it's not recommended to upgrade? So as with any software release, right, it's general availability. It is a stable release. Just recommendations to upgrade come over stability and attack cases over time, right? So our preferred releases, I should say, are recommended after a PAN-OS release has been out for a certain amount of time, and we can say, yes, there's no major bugs that we need to worry about or anything else. This is the same for any vendor out there. Anybody that's releasing software should be doing this. Just as you probably wouldn't want to go for, mission critical system, you probably wouldn't want to go to a brand new Windows Server OS. Day one it's released, same reason that you would want to consider looking at what the preferred release is for PAN-OS. So we'll definitely let you know once PAN-OS 9.1 is preferred. It is a very, very stable release so far, though, everything that I've seen working with TAC and TAC engineering. All right, is there a way to view bandwidth usage, basically how taxed is the GP gateway? So there are a few ways to look at that. If you have an Snmp monitoring tool, you can go do it through MIBs, the specific MIBs for that Snmp stream. We do have GlobalProtect specific MIBs in there. You do also have the option to, again, if you separate out the zone, you can create an ACC tab that's specific to that zone to look at what your utilization is for that specific and what traffic for that specific zone, as well as what traffic is coming through. The other option you have as well is to, let's see, what other options do we have? In Panorama, you have the ability to track interfaces and see how utilized they are. So if your GlobalProtect connection is over a dedicated interface, you can always utilize that as well. So a few options in that regards. PanaOS 9.1 does have some enhanced logging around that as well. I just have a question that says, any suggestions on this? Let me see if I have, oh, I have the question above it. So question here is, we have GP set up across 2 data centers. Users connect to primary data center, always connect via IPsec. However, users connecting to secondary DC connect via SSL. However, I have a couple of my colleagues and myself connected to both DCs via IPsec, whereas the rest all connect via SSL on secondary DC. I couldn't tell you. Drawing a blank on that one, especially if somebody connects and somebody doesn't. Aaron, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, sorry, previously I was stuck on double mute. So just in general, the part of the configuration involves the option of leveraging IPsec or SSL. So depending upon what the question is, if you want to keep it consistent to only use IPsec or only use SSL at both data centers, it sounds based on the wording that there's a configuration in place that is just allowing it to fail back to one or the other. But all of those options are configurable. So I would recommend just double checking the admin guide. We have some shorter snippets that are specific to that scenario, leveraging IPsec and or SSL as a fallback. And then of course, just, if you fall short there, opening attack case.
Good stuff. Thank you, sir. So question from earlier, yeah, it does use the pan local cert. So that's probably why your user's home Mac cannot connect, because it doesn't know about that pan local cert. It's not a trusted certificate authority to that Mac, right? Because it's not part of your PKI. So I would look at maybe utilizing, a trusted cert from Entrust or GoDaddy or whoever else out there that can possibly provide one of those certificates. Let's see here else. What do we got? Is there a way to generate a custom report of all users that are connected to GP group by hour? So for sure there is in PanaOS 9.0 or 9.1, excuse me. Aaron, any thoughts on prior to 9.1? I know there's some CLI stuff that could be done that some users do. Any other thoughts?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I was researching another one and I missed the beginning.
Yeah, so is there a way to generate a custom report of all the users that are connected to a GP group by hour?
Got it. Sorry. So, and sorry, Dave, if you mentioned this, but I kind of gravitate towards just what's available native to the web UI. So if you go monitor tab, network tab, and then down towards the bottom left, gateways under the GlobalProtect section, the current connected users and previously connected users. If it doesn't give you everything you're after there, it at least is a starting point to know what the corresponding logs look like. And the reason I word it like that is because we have pretty granular options with Snmp MIB. So if you're leveraging a tool like SolarWinds or any network monitoring tool, if you want to actually graph things like throughput and sessions specific to GlobalProtect connections, you can take all of that a step further with an Snmp network monitoring tool as well. Yeah. And that kind of takes the PanaOS version out of the equation, with the caveat that we of course add more in newer versions. But I believe we're pretty consistent from 8.0 up until 9.1, and 9.1 has some additional functionality, but nothing super relevant to that specific question, at least.
Yeah, yeah. The other thought I have too is you can always create a custom report that looks at the system log, as we called out earlier, and look for specific connections during an hour time frame and have it run hourly to provide you that report. So there is that option as well. Okay, cool. How can we assign out a fixed IP to a GP client? The easiest way to do it would be to, hopefully you're not doing this pervasively across all of your remote users, but the easiest way to do this would be to create a custom client configuration for that specific end user, right? So it's a specific user that's logging in, and then just give them a /32 IP address to connect to. And that's the specific fixed IP that they would have. Aaron, any other thoughts you would have around fixed IP for a GP client?
The only other thing I would add is if you're open to leveraging radius vendor specific attributes, or VSAs. You can pass framed IP address. You can pass, you know, things like IP details via radius exchanges as well. That's quite a bit more involved than the solution that Dave mentioned, but quite a bit more robust as well. So some additional work up front, but a more scalable option, I would argue, long term.
Got it. By the way, for the Mac question, I just went ahead and sent a answer to the answer to column for that. There's a Reddit link, it looks like, specific to that one. So thank you all for helping each other out too. Greatly appreciate that. Does GlobalProtect support DHC relay? Currently today it does not, but I highly recommend you reach out to your account team to have a roadmap discussion. That's unfortunately all I can say on that one. In HA pair configuration, are GlobalProtect connections load balanced between the two PAN devices are all terminated on the active node? Aaron, I'm going to let you answer that one. I pretty well know that it's terminated on a single node, but I'm going to let you answer that one in detail, being my HA expert.
Yeah, so it kind of depends on how it's configured, but by default, sorry, I just needed to double check the wording. Okay, so if it's a single HA pair and it's active passive, then by design, all of the IP addresses on the data plane interfaces are just passive on the secondary unit. So not until something fails on the primary unit do the interfaces on the previous secondary unit gratuitously ARP out onto the network. So in that scenario, yes, all sessions do terminate on the gateway on the active primary firewall. In an active-active configuration, which is an option, I typically try to talk through, you know, active-passive is the first recommendation. It just reduces the amount of complexity in terms of troubleshooting, and this is a great example of just an extra path, an extra firewall, an extra set of gateways that could add a layer of complexity for troubleshooting that's just not necessary with active-passive. Nevertheless, if you are implementing an active-active HA pair of firewalls, then yes, by design, all of the IP addresses on the data plane interfaces are unique, and therefore you could configure gateways per unit with, again, corresponding unique FQDNs, certificates, IP addresses. So you could certainly spread those gateways across those units at that point.
Yep. I think one of the key things to keep in mind, though, is if you have active, either HA pair, excuse me, HA pairs aren't necessarily increasing. You're not doubling your amount of supported connections, as it were, right? So you want to keep that in mind too. Is just because you have an HA pair, you're not doubling the resources that are available. They are HA for failover and for fault tolerance and fault resistance, things on that line. I'm using ping ID. The display message from GP client is not displaying the full message. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with ping ID's MFA side. Aaron, any thoughts on that one? Or?
Yeah, I'm actually working through this exact issue with a state right now, and we are working with ping ID as one of the supported vendors that we have for things like MFA, which, just for the benefit of the rest of the group, it's the canned list we have for all things multi-factor authentication are not just ping, but also Okta, Duo, and RSA. And as we've discussed already on this call, as long as they're using Radius, the list is very extensive at that point. But anyhow, the short answer is we're not quite there yet. There's some disconnect between the characters that are being exchanged for that pop-up window. There is a configurable option there, but it's not very clear within our documentation or theirs how to modify that. So I believe we'll have a better solution, a better answer soon, but right now it is just trying to cram your message into the space that's available in that canned window is the best recommendation at the moment.
There you go. If you have a teenager at home, ask them how to shorten that via text message or Twitter. I guess would be the recommendation, right? Sorry, bad joke. To exclude client application process name for Zoom, would the following syntax be good? I don't know Zoom's application process. It looks good to me. Any thoughts on that one, Aaron, around specifically?
Yeah, I guess just kind of a broader answer, revisiting a couple of the topics that are already provided here. Just in general, yeah, I mean, I'm in the same boat as Dave. I'd have to double check the syntax, but as long as we have an app ID for an application in general, we should be in good shape there. I'd have to double check the syntax to make sure. But taking that a step back, I'm always a big fan of, instead of just whitelisting applications, consider tightening up your security policy. So leave all the traffic funneled through the tunnel, but then, either map the traffic to a QoS policy and potentially, rate limit delay sensitive applications, or conversely prioritize them above everything else that could be best effort. But at least keeping all of the traffic funneled through the tunnel still retains full visibility. So even if you're blocking things like Pandora and Iheartradio, you at least still see that traffic, versus anything that you whitelist, obviously you lose the visibility at that point. It's by design not even traversing the tunnel. So potentially worth taking a step back and revisiting those. The one exception that always to me makes sense to consider is online backup applications like Code 42 and Carbonite. Typically they're encrypted. Presumably they're trusted. All the endpoints on the far end are trusted if you're paying for those solutions. So I think those are great to consider whitelisting. I just kind of, not necessarily caution, but I think it's worth revisiting any other applications to determine, okay, should we still send them down the pipe, even if we might block the application? Because again, then at least when you come back in that next Monday morning, you have a trouble ticket that you need to work through. You have a single repository to go into to look through all the logs, whether the traffic was blocked or not, versus the traffic being whitelisted, punted outside of the tunnel. You don't even know what happened after that, right? You don't really have visibility into what could have caused a poor end user experience after that. So just factor that into that kind of a decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, specifically, it looks like this user's trying to improve their performance, through the tunnel. So yeah, specifically for Zoom, that one looks, it matches what I have on my Mac. But again, just because I have it on my Mac doesn't necessarily mean, and I don't even know what Zoom version I'm running, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be any different. So looks good to me, but I would definitely double check that it's equivalent across all of your install base, as it were. Will adding an additional IP range to the IP pool under client settings cause disruptions to clients? No, it should not. If you are adding to the range, then it should not. Just keep in mind that you do have the option to order it, right? So if you want that range to be primary and you flip it around, then new clients connecting will get from that IP range. But if you're adding to it, you should not cause any disruptions. And definitely be mindful of, if you are having end users that are unable to connect, that's one of the first places I would go check too, especially if everybody's connecting fine and all of a sudden they're not. I know my previous install base, we only had a few hundred remote users originally, and now they probably have, I think they last looked at 16,000, right? So definitely the need for a bigger IP pool in that regards. Will adding the security to an existing NAT policy interrupt service? I'm going to imagine you mean security zone. Yeah, okay, cool. Security zone to existing NAT policy interrupt service? No, it will not interrupt service for existing traffic. As long as you are not removing the other zone, then you're good. So you should be good to go to add that zone to an existing NAT policy. And good job remembering the NAT policy too. It's one of my biggest pains in the rears originally when I was administering the firewalls. You'd always forget about the NAT policy because you hardly ever touch it, right? Do you know if Chromebooks, Android and non-Android, have the ability to force users to use GlobalProtect? So I'm going to preface this with, keep in mind that Chromebooks Google is doing away with Chrome apps, right? So Chrome extensions are still going to be there, but Chrome apps are going to go away. So keep in mind that GlobalProtect is a full tunnel, right? We don't just go through and proxy traffic like some of the other vendors out there would. So when you look at SIPA compliance, if you're okay with just URL filtering and not taking into consideration all the other SIPA compliant requirements around hacking or preventing students from going to other inappropriate sites, which might not be caught by a URL filter, then extensions may work for you in that case, and proxies may work for you. So Chromebooks, for the way that we have been steered by Google, are specifically going to utilize the Android functionality that is containerized within those Chromebooks. So the non-GP application or the non-Android application, excuse me, does have a solution, and many school districts are utilizing that today, but keep in mind that that's going away. So if you are looking at doing GlobalProtect on Chromebooks, I would strongly recommend you look at doing the Android solution. And we do have the ability to enforce always on, as well as a single sign-on for those end users as well. So it's getting to be a pretty slick solution. And we're actually working on a webinar specifically around GlobalProtect on Chromebooks as well. So that is coming, definitely coming down the pipe for you. Aaron, got another one for you here that was just posted into the Q&A. So following up on the HA load balancing question, our HA setup is active passive, but the vast majority of our clients are displaying on the passive pair. 8 on active, 29 on passive per remote user's screen. Similarly, some of our users are not listed on either node. Have you seen this before, or any advice on resolving before reaching out to tech?
Yeah, so kind of going back to just the fundamental concept of active passive, the IP addresses on the passive unit they don't exist. There's no ARP entry until the active unit fails. So the only thing I can think of in that scenario is if the firewalls are failing over and there's a kind of temporary point in time where the secondary unit was actually active, which again, I mean, just to kind of double click on that point, unless you have a network monitoring tool that's alerting you when one is active versus the other, by design, that's actually very seamless. So that could be happening and nobody's even aware of it. And in that situation, I could see how the configuration and the state is synchronized between the units. And so at any given time, and the primary unit may be active and documenting the current sessions and then the previous sessions. And then during a failover, the secondary unit is capturing the same. Outside of that, I don't see a way that that's even possible unless there is some sort of an active configuration in place, maybe inadvertent or otherwise. So another good call to maybe just get a sanity check from TAC to make sure that the configuration, as everybody understands it, is actually in place. But otherwise, my initial thought is that it might just be the nature of an active-passive unit failing over and allowing those users to seamlessly connect to to both units as they're being active.
Yeah, and I'll do a little PSA here. As you can imagine, with everybody working remotely and trying to get things configured and running into issues that they possibly didn't have before, TAC is definitely under a pretty heavy load. So we are definitely trying to accommodate those as best as possible.
Just a couple of random topics I guess I would throw out there. One of the questions that I took note of that was asked on the first 2 webinars was around client IP pool subnets and whether or not adding an additional subnet would potentially cause connectivity issues for existing clients. And the answer to that is no. And to take that a step further, it's actually a best practice to include multiple non-contiguous IP ranges there. And the reason, the primary reason at least, is if you have a remote user and they're connecting from Starbucks or a hotel or their home for that matter, it is possible that the RFC 1918 private IP subnet that they're actually in locally will conflict with whatever range that you have configured. So having some multiple options listed in that client IP pool list is a good idea, and we've got some documentation that supports that. And then I guess the other one is top of mind just primarily because of COVID-19 and the need for most organizations to support remote working, obviously, but also remote learning. So potentially, depending upon whether or not you're an existing next-gen firewall customer, whether you have GlobalProtect licensed or not, and again, the model of the firewall dictates the max number of remote sessions that it can support. That scenario was another question that came up on both webinars. And so I guess the main thing I'm trying to relay there is there's the max number of GlobalProtect sessions that each model can support, but that's really only a small part of the equation. You still have to determine what applications you're going to allow your users to use while they're connected. And depending upon how much throughput those applications are attempting to use, that number needs to be divided by the overall number of users that you're wanting to connect. So I know I'm kind of stating the obvious there, but I guess I just wanted to kind of talk through that and maybe recommend scrutinizing your security policies proactively, determine what you want your mission critical applications to be, include those in a security policy that corresponds to your GlobalProtect or VPN zone, whether it's then traffic going back outbound to the internet or inside to your on-prem data center resources or both. Understanding what you want that security policy to look like up front is very helpful there. And then to take that a step further, if there's a use case to split tunnel, we touched on this in the webinar, but we have more granular options now than we used to. So in addition to just split tunneling based on, layer 3 and layer 4 information, we can also split tunnel based on layer 7 criteria. So if you've got a top talker, a heavy hitter, a delay sensitive voice video protocol that is you want to permit, so maybe not like Pandora or Iheartradio, maybe you just block those, but maybe you want to permit any of your collaboration tools, like in this case, Zoom, maybe it makes sense to leave that traffic outside of the tunnel. Another one that has come up a couple of times is online backup solutions like Code 42 and Carbonite. Again, those are typically encrypted. They may be consuming a lot of bandwidth, and there might not be a ton of value in pushing that down the GlobalProtect tunnel. So consider revisiting security policy and establishing a whitelist stance, for lack of better words, and how you want to approach those two topics. But we've got great documentation out there that has, I would say, been improved upon significantly just in the last 6 or 12 months. So none of those concepts are new probably to anybody on the call, but some of our corresponding documentation may be. So please revisit some of those documents and let us know if anybody has questions beyond that.
Perfect. Thanks, Aaron. So a few questions did come up while you were chatting. So first and foremost, when talking about adding additional non-contiguous IP pools for the client, are you saying that it will pick a different IP pool to avoid conflict?
Correct. And I'll dig up the link that we've got a link that I've had bookmarked for a while now that talks about that scenario exactly. But yes, imagine if your IP pool was 10.0.0.0/24, and the end user is at, like I said, Starbucks, hotel, or whatever, and they just happen to get an IP from that exact same range. Proactively putting a second subnet in there that's not in the 10/8 at all is a common practice. So just pick a different range: 192.168, 172.16. These are just random. You don't have to use those numbers. But yes, if the agent determines that it's already in that subnet, it'll proactively pick the next in the list.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Also, what is the license feature called for DNS-based split tunneling? That's our GlobalProtect license. So you'll see that one of our GlobalProtect subscription, I should say. So the feature is in there as of PanOS, I want to say 8.0 or 8.1. So it does require you to be running a newer version of PanOS. But the ability to turn that on and push it down to your clients is done through the GlobalProtect subscription. Again, we are offering that for free for 90 days, and you can enable that through your customer support portal. So if you open up support.polishnetworks.com, navigate to your assets list, you should be able to enable Eval licenses on those specific devices. By default, it enables for 30 days. If you need that extended, please make sure you reach out to your Palo Alto Networks support team or your Palo Alto Networks sales team, and let us know, and that way we'll get that extended for you. Please also reach out and give us a week lead time to get that extended, and try not to reach out the day before or the day of it expiring. So is there a simple user and setup doc for non-technical users that will be connecting? We're looking to roll out ours to 1,500 users, and most are not very technical. Yeah, actually there is. I was trying to find it. I'll have to find it and I'll send it out to the group. But there is a set of templates depending on the GlobalProtect version that you have agent version, that is. And then you can go through and essentially just copy and paste your logo in there and your specific portal configuration information, generate that into a PDF, and then post that on whatever portal you want for those, or email it to your end users for them to get to. So we do have that. I don't have it readily available. I'll have to find that. Is there a recommended GP client version? There is. Let me look it up. Unless, Mr. McAllister, do you know it off the top of your head?
I should. I'm looking right now to make sure I'm not stale on it, but 1 second here.
We both should, right? Yeah, so 508 or 511 are preferred releases.
Just to add to that, for anyone else that might have a similar question, I just pasted in the link to the answer that's got the overarching PanOS guidance. The reason I thought it'd be worth revisiting that is because I've been here for 6 years, and for the entire time, our ETAC team, that is an internal team, and one of their primary responsibilities is to monitor all of the attack cases across the world, and then from an overall stability standpoint, make recommendations on what is preferred. So as Dave mentioned earlier on the firewall side, PanOS 8.1.13 and 9.0.6, those are both ETAC preferred. And then, as he mentioned, 5.1.1 for the GlobalProtect agent. If you scroll down on that page, you'll see other things like the VM series firewalls, as well as Panorama, but also GlobalProtect is listed as well. So that's a handy resource. My main point there is that now it's a publicly facing page. So bookmark that one if anybody's or everybody on the call is responsible for upgrading PanOS, GlobalProtect agent versions. If you don't have that link bookmarked, I highly recommend hanging on to it.
So we got another question here. When it comes to network speed over the VPN back to files or work resources, is there anything to look at to speed things up? We have a gig connection on the 3220, and 50 people utilizing VPN feels sluggish getting to work resources. One of the main ones I would recommend checking out is see if you have IPsec enabled under the tunnel configuration. So, or enable IPsec for the tunnel. I know IPsec tunnel is generally a lot faster than the SSL tunnel is. Some of the other tuning stuff you could do, as we've mentioned, write QoS specific applications that might not be business critical. If you need to separate out specific applications that might not need to go back over that tunnel as well. Unfortunately, it can, it does end up being that somebody does go through and start hogging a lot of resources. And it is a finite resource when you look at the on-prem solution. Right, so that might be another option. Also take into consideration that it is a shared resource. So if you have, that gig connection going out to the internet, but you still have maybe internet-based backups from on-premise servers up to cloud-hosted backups or cloud-hosted storage services, those are still taking up bandwidth as well. So you kind of have to think maybe a little bit holistic about what's going on there. But Aaron, any other thoughts? Or Derek, any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, this is Aaron. I was just going to follow up. So in the chat window specific to that question, I just added the link that is tied to the page that we've mentioned several times, which is optimized split tunneling. So I just want to make sure that everybody had that page to start from, but to then clarify that for me, with my security hat on, I actually prefer to leverage security policies. So as I mentioned earlier, if you allow all of the traffic to go through the tunnel, even if you block some of the top talkers, again, like Pandora, Iheartradio, you at least still retain full visibility. As soon as you leverage the whitelisting approach, then all of the traffic for those applications by design does not enter the tunnel, which means we won't have any corresponding logs on the firewall. So take care before taking that approach. But depending upon what the question was, as far as trying to proactively determine what users and or what traffic is causing the congestion, if that truly is the culprit, I'm a big fan of the app scope section. I think it's a section that isn't talked about often enough. So if you can picture your web UI on PanOS, the monitor tab, and then about halfway down on the left-hand side, you'll see app scope. Specifically the network monitor. That page allows you to just in a couple of clicks build a filter based on source subnet, a set of applications, go back 6 hours, 24 hours, a week or longer. And so it's just a quick way to see, okay, these are the users. This is our, if you specify subnet, for example, these are the GlobalProtect related users, and these are the applications that they're using, and this is how much bandwidth they've consumed over that previous 24 hours or whatever a good sample period is. So I would say that's a lot of bang for the buck just starting there. And then if nothing jumps out, I kind of recommend two things there. There are a couple of buttons that'll default to bytes, which should be the most helpful there, but you can, the graphic just to the adjacent to that one will change it to sessions. Kind of toggling back and forth between those can be helpful. And then if nothing jumps out after looking at all of that information, two other things that I usually point out are, one, everything I just described can be pulled via Snmp. So we have MIBs that correspond to connected users, duration of the connection, and then of course we have MIBs that correspond to throughput and how much actual bandwidth users are using. So if you've got a network monitoring tool, that's I always recommend that as a better long-term solution than anything on box, just because you can graph things over weeks or months, which can give you more context. The last thing I guess I would mention, just again, depending upon what the issue is, if you find that your issue is unique to some users, you might just double check what their connection looks like. As David mentioned, whether IPsec is enabled or not. There are pros and cons between IPsec and SSL. If you are using IPsec, there could be a fragmentation MTU related issue that is somewhat difficult to troubleshoot. And so that piece of it is a little bit harder to identify and maybe a longer discussion, but simply changing the config from IPsec to SSL can quickly rule that out if it's related to packet fragmentation or MTU. So I'll leave it at that for now. But we will happily follow up if there are other similar questions that we don't get to throughout the duration of this call, but those are at least some of my initial thoughts.
Cool, perfect. And I did just post an answer to the original question around, is there any end user setup doc? I did post the Knowledgebase article. I finally did find it. However, I did notice as well that the 5.0 setup doc link is broken. So I just emailed our product management to make sure that gets updated. I do have those stored somewhere on my computer. I'll be sure to attach those as well as I send it out to everybody alongside the GlobalProtect, the presentation that we did as well. All right. I guess the only other thing I want to touch on too, I did see TAC mentioned in a couple of comments on the back end, as well as a specific question. Please keep in mind that every customer pretty much in the world, right? A third of the world is on this lockdown status. So please keep in mind that pretty much every other customer is in the same boat, and a lot of people are calling into TAC for support. So please try to be as patient as possible. I understand that sometimes wait times are a little bit painful. We are trying to ramp up to support as many remote sessions as possible. We have the same stay-at-home orders as well. So we need to try to manage that accordingly, and a lot of our folks are working from home. But that being said, as always, best practices for tech cases are going to be log into support.paloaltonetworks.com. You're able to set your own priority for that case there. Please set it as true as possible, as well as be as descriptive as possible in exactly what's going on, so that way we can get that case routed accordingly. Just saying that GlobalProtect is not working is very vague, but being able to specifically say that, hey, I'm having these specific performance issues over, I'm just using the one we just answered, but I'm having these specific performance issues over a specific tunnel, and here's what I've tried so far, as well as download a tech support file off of your firewall and upload that as you're opening the case. Definitely speeds up that process. What allows you to do as well, since you select your priority, when you call in, you get put into the proper queue, you get directed to the right folks that should be able to help you troubleshoot that. And more often than not, even though it doesn't feel like it, about 80, what was the last number I saw? 83% of our cases are answered online within a day of them being opened. So more often than not, we're able to get you the resources as quickly as needed online. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's just my plea for you know, a little bit of support on our end as well as we continue to help you out. But as always, you know, Polished Networks is here to help. So please let your account team especially know if you have any specific issues that you're trying to address. Are we able to share the FQDN of our GlobalProtect portal and the clientless VPN? Are there any resources for setting up clientless VPN that you can recommend? So specifically, you're talking about the GlobalProtect portal where you log in and get the agent from, and then the clientless VPN portal. Those actually are separated out. I think when you have clientless VPN, it's separated out on a different port. I don't remember the port off the top of my head. Aaron, I don't know if you know that by chance. I'd have to look it up.
Yeah, I saw the question and I was just researching it myself. I'd be surprised if we can't share the same FQDN and IP address. I have not personally tried it, so I would need to do some digging on that and follow up.
Yeah, and then specifically around clientless VPN setup, that website that I just showed does have some clientless VPN configuration guides in there, as well as the admin guide as well. So definitely, if they're, you know, those would be the first two places I would start to get that up and running and configured. And it works great. You know, I've helped many customers set that up for internal resources that they may need access to. Let's see here. So could you use HIP rules to put failing clients on a remediation network in the use case of AOVPN? So yeah, I mean, essentially a HIP check becomes a aspect of a security policy that you build out. So you could definitely put those clients into a specific security policy subset that only allows them access to update services, for example, or only allows them read-only access to specific websites or specific services. Really the world's your oyster when you start to get into some of those configuration aspects. You could get extremely granular in regards to what you want to allow, or you can stay a little bit more broad spectrum in regards to failed clients versus non-failed clients. You could even get down to failed clients in regards to antivirus versus failed clients in regards to Windows version they're running, right? So you could definitely get really granular. It all depends on how you're building your security policy base in that regards. Aaron, any thoughts on those yourself, sir?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add there is just the concepts of tags and dynamic address groups. So in the off chance that, you know, the HIP data that's being exchanged all looks good and there's nothing within that data itself that would trigger any kind of subsequent traffic to hit a different security policy as David's describing. Let's say somebody is temporarily, the GlobalProtect agent is disabled and they are browsing the web freely. They mouse over a hidden iframe, they click on a link, somehow they get owned and there's subsequent command and control traffic. Well, with that, as long as your next-gen firewall has at least the threat prevention license and ideally the DNS security subscription as well, based on command and control traffic and any threat-related signature like that, we could also on the fly, again, with the concept of dynamic address group, we can have the subsequent traffic subjected to a different security policy. So yes, the short answer is yes. You know, the third phase of the answer, it depends, you know, I would say the firewall can't do anything about the traffic it doesn't see. So the caveat might be a need to revisit internal segmentation. But as long as the traffic, all traffic in question is traversing the firewall or being fed to the firewall via that HIP data, then absolutely, you can certainly subject their traffic to a different security policy and only allow their access to, you know, remediation servers, patch management servers, AV servers, things like that.
There we go. Thank you, sir. Let's see. Do you know how often HIP information is updated from the GlobalProtect client? Can this interval be configured? Aaron, do you know that off the top of your head? It's really bad. I should know that.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I was double checking. I want to say, well, I don't want to relay the wrong info here. Let me see if I can find the default frequency. It is configurable, but let me see if I can track down that value real quick.
Yeah, I'm looking as well. The first one where both of us are actually looking. Look at that. Need to put that on the PCNSE question questionnaire would be a good one. Another question here, can we enforce always on VPN and disable internet access on the client when the VPN fails? I believe on Windows and Mac devices, you can control internet access if, let me find that setting. That sounds awfully familiar. Let's see. Yeah, two of them, 2 in a row that are hard hitters that I should know off the top of my head, but any thoughts, Aaron? Or are you still researching the other one?
Yeah, I was hesitant to relay what the value I thought off my top of the head. The top of my head was every 1 hour, but I fear that might be PANOA specific. So we can follow up with, you know, if that value is different in 9.0, 9.1, or even 8.1. I'll just need to double check that, but it looks like by default it. If there's nothing changing via logs, for example, then it'll check in every 1 hour as a worst case scenario.
Yeah.
So yes, on the second one, as far as the always on VPN, there are configuration options to limit what network traffic can leave that endpoint. I've tested that with Windows. I don't have any stick time even with Mac, but I believe you're right, Dave, that functionality is specific to Windows and Mac.
Yeah, Windows 7 or above, or Mac OS 9 or above. I will go ahead and post that. It's a link to the 7.1 version, but it's supported in 8.0.8.1, 9.0.9.1 as well. So I'll post that as an answer to the question as well. So that is definitely available. Is there any support for TOTP for MFA without an external service? I'm not familiar with TOTP. What does TOPT stand for? I'm drawing a blank. Time-based one-time password. Without an external service. No, I'm going to say not currently. There's not, right? So a lot of authentication, unless it's a local user on the endpoint, or I'm sorry, local user on the firewall, all authentication is done externally, right? We're just an enforcer for that authentication method, whichever you may choose. So if we're talking about time-based one-time passwords, then at this time, that would still need to be handled by a third party or an external. And looking for HIP information updates. Derek, have you found anything yet? You looking? I guess you're presenting, so you wouldn't be able to research as much.
Yeah, the only thing I found on the live community is just similar to what Aaron was saying as far as the 1 hour interval, and there's some CLI commands to update or change that. Yeah,
so it looks like default is 1 hour. You can update it, but it does have to be done through the CLI, and that was posted last year. So I'm guessing that might still be true. HIP check interval is in milliseconds as well. So it looks like it can be updated, but it is configurable through CLI. I wonder if that's changed in 9.1. I would have to look at that. I'll go ahead and post.
Yeah, and I noticed a note there too that it would affect all users, all portals, and the setting will remain after firewall reboot.
Yeah, it is a global set. Is there API support for updating certificates programmatically? I'm thinking about automated renewals of certificates through AD services or Let's Encrypt. Yeah, I mean, the official way to do that would be through SCEP, Simple Certificate Enrollment. What does the P stand for in SCEP? But that would be the best way to do it, right? And you can utilize that for certificate renewals and enrollment, things along that line. But yeah, our API does include also the deployment of certificates, pulling of the CSR as well as pushing the signed certificate back as well. So that definitely is available through the API as well on the firewalls. Do you have a list of supported HIP checks? Yeah, I'm sure we can find that. We'll find that and get that posted here shortly. So what skill sets are needed to implement custom HIP checks? How to best answer that one? I guess just understanding what the services, right? What the antivirus is that you have on your endpoint. what specific processes you may want running, what specific versions of Windows OS you might want running. Just make sure that those are well known, right, as you're going through and creating these, and understanding what they are across your environment. You know, I came from a pretty complicated environment where we had about 40,000 end users, and we had devices from Windows devices to Mac devices and a bunch of different Windows devices, as it were. We did standardize on AV at least, but you know, some organizations, I know certain subsets of that organization may use different AV than the others. So just being mindful of all the AV that you have, any specific processes that you want running for folks to be able to connect through, as well as, you know, I would say start with simpler checks, like making sure the device is up to date, making sure AV is up to date. And then as you start building it out, you can dive a little bit deeper. The nice part about it, when you do hip checks, you can actually see what the information is through when you right click on the GlobalProtect client and you go to, let's see, when you go to settings and there is a host profile. So you click on the GlobalProtect client settings host profile, you'll actually see the time the hip check was generated, as well as the categories of what's being collected and what's being sent up. So it gives you a little bit more information in regards to what exactly you're supposed to be looking for. But if you're going to start generating custom checks, it's a little bit more difficult to say exactly what skill sets you need. I think it's all in understanding what you're trying to control. But again, you know, it's kind of the KISS method of security. Initially, let's keep it simple first. And then start building up exactly to what we need to fully improve our security posture in that regards.
Yeah, and just real quick, the only thing I might add to that, and this is hopefully relevant to both of the last questions that Mr. Hunt asked, but if you can picture the firewall web UI, the objects tab, and then GlobalProtect HIP objects specifically, if you were to just navigate there and then click add, you'll see just the top level configuration kind of subcomponents. So patch management, client-side firewall, anti-malware, disk backup, disk encryption, data loss prevention, certificates, even before you get to things like custom checks. I've been here for 6 years. I cover Colorado and Utah, and I think the answer of the skill sets as far as, you know, who's responsible for each of those things will vary wildly, right? Depending upon if it's a state level agency versus, you know, a smaller school district, might have one person that's dedicated to each of those, or might have one person that's responsible for all of the above. But in terms of, you know, which skill sets are needed, I think that kind of frames in a good starting point. And then maybe more relevant to the previous question right before that, if I just pick on the anti-malware subcomponent, and then I go to add a specific vendor, there are dozens, if not well over 100 vendors that are supported in that drop-down list. So I always encourage folks, as you're looking at you know, implementing anything HIP related, start there. And if you're coming off of a different NAC solution, or if you're looking at this in parallel in conjunction with another NAC vendor, I always recommend start here. And again, if you've done a good job of internal segmentation and all traffic to and from client, server, and otherwise segments have to traverse the firewall anyhow, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised with the HIP-related functionality that GlobalProtect offers. But dig into that first. So objects, GlobalProtect HIP objects, add, and then kind of just sift through each of those options and start there. And hopefully that'll better define a good starting point for next steps.
We got another question here. Would we be able to disallow a user from logging into the GlobalProtect VPN at all if they do not meet a HIP check? I don't believe we will disallow it, but you can definitely have a much stricter security policy in place if that end user does fail that HIP check, as well as one of the things that Aaron touched on earlier with granular log filtering and granular log actions. We could have that trigger an email out to a ServiceNow system or some type of ticketing system to create a ticket that says, hey, this failed. And maybe part of creating that ticket is also emailing that user and saying, hey, you know, you have very limited access to your you know, very limited access while logged in through the remote network because your system is out of date or whatever you want to put in that general message, right? Please work with IT to get it updated. Aaron, are you familiar with any way of just straight out disallowing it if the HIP check's not met?
No, but I think we're saying the same thing, where if you're familiar with what the security policies look like specific to the HIP profile column, and I'll pause there just because it may or may not even be visible on your default security policy list. So if for whatever reason, anybody that's listening, if you can picture your security policies, so policy tab, security, there are a finite amount of columns that are listed there by default. If you mouse over the little drop-down arrow columns, if you don't already see the HIP profile column there, you can then add it. And then when you're building security policies, the relevant section is underneath the user tab. So again, security policy, add, user tab, and then off to the right, you'll see HIP profile. So my point of all of that is, even if the initial outcome is, I guess I would actually take a step back and argue you might not want to disallow them from authenticating altogether or connecting altogether. I think that there would be value in not only allowing them to connect, but subjecting their traffic to a different security policy so that you can see what's going on. You've got full visibility into all of their traffic. And then again, if you then only allow that next security policy that their traffic is hitting on the fly to gain access to things like remediation servers, patch management servers, all of those options are configurable, but I think that second, leveraging a different security policy with specific HIP profile checks in there will kind of allow you to take that next step of remediation. Whereas if you were to just not allow them to access anything, you're kind of at the mercy of, basically walking across campus or physically accessing that machine at that point, which, depending upon the environment, that might make sense, but might not scale in every environment. So short answer is you can accomplish the same goal, but I highly recommend looking at that HIP profile subcomponent of a security policy and seeing what your options are, even after they may be compromised or exhibiting some sort of indicators of compromise.
Yep. And I would also say that's another reason why it's important to consider utilizing the VPN specific zone for GlobalProtect as well, because, by default in a Palo Alto Networks firewall, intra-zone traffic is allowed. So if something doesn't hit a specific security policy above and you're dropping that VPN zone into your inside or your trusted zone just during initial setup, then those users may have access to other resources that you maybe didn't necessarily want them to have access to. But if you create a VPN specific zone, then it hits that interzone rule at the bottom, which is explicit deny. So just kind of keep that in mind as well in regards to your traffic and how it's flowing in that regards. Can you use HIP internally without VPN for traffic traversing the firewall? Absolutely, and we have many customers that do. Within GlobalProtect, you still have to have the GlobalProtect agent on the endpoint, but we have a technology or aspect of GlobalProtect we call internal gateways. So essentially what happens is when GlobalProtect starts up, right, end user logs into the firewall, GlobalProtect starts up. One of the first checks it does is see if it can identify a specific DNS record that you call out. That DNS record should be available inside or should be resolvable inside, should not be resolvable outside. If it is resolvable, it checks it against whatever it should be resolving against. You provide that information. If it gets the correct information, then it will still send HIP information. It'll still send user ID information, all that fun stuff, but it will not create the tunnel back to the firewall. That being said, I do actually have customers that utilize GlobalProtect internally because they have a specific need to tunnel either specific traffic or they have a specific need to tunnel all of their traffic back for certain endpoints. From one part of their network to another part of the network over secure tunnel for compliance reasons. So, but yeah, absolutely. What you would want to look at is configuring an internal gateway in that regards. Love being able to answer these questions. So I really appreciate everybody joining and taking time out of their busy days as well. So with that being said, thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy, and try to stay sane as well as we all go through all this fun stuff. So with that being said, thank you so much. You have a good one.
Thanks, David, for all these great Q&A sessions. I'll do my best to record the questions asked in the description field for others who had similar questions. As always, we welcome all questions and comments below. If you enjoyed watching this video, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe to be notified of all of our new videos coming from the live community. Thanks again and have a great day.